So risk for addiction can broadly be categorized into 3 buckets: nature, nurture, and neighborhood. When we talk about nature, we're talking about our inborn or inherited risk. This is our DNA, the protein expression that we have inherited from our parents. And we do know that people are born with differing degrees of vulnerability to addiction. This is based in part on family studies showing that if you have a biological parent who's an alcoholic, you are at increased risk to become an alcoholic yourself, even if raised from birth outside of that home in a pro-social, non-drinking home. So there's some sort of innate inborn risk, which is probably tied to impulsivity, which is an enduring character trait. People who are impulsive are people who have difficulty pressing the pause button between desire to do something and doing it. It's an enduring trait, and people who are more impulsive are more likely to get addicted. People who have some kind of frontal lobe dysfunction or challenge, for example, people who have problems paying attention are at higher risk for addiction. People who tend to get easily emotionally dysregulated, innately, those folks are at higher risk for addiction. In other words, people struggling from the panoply of co-occurring psychiatric disorders are innately at higher risk of getting addicted. And also there's this just inherited addictogenic sort of vulnerability. But that's not the only bucket of risk. There's also nurture, which is to say how you were raised. Another way of saying that is epigenetics, or the ways that our experiences change gene expression and protein expression. And we know that people who live in families where substance use is explicitly or implicitly condoned, those are families where kids are more likely to get addicted. Conversely, if you live in a family where your parents are checking up on you regularly, know where you are and what you're doing, and have healthy attachments, those folks are less likely to get addicted. And then the full spectrum in between, people who struggle with serious emotional, physical, sexual abuse as children are at higher risk for addiction. The third bucket is what I call neighborhood, and this gets into the environmental risk factors that make people prone to addiction. There are many, including unemployment, poverty, multi-generational trauma, social dislocation, but also importantly, simple access. So if you live in a neighborhood where you have easy access to a drug, you're more likely to try that drug and more likely to get addicted to that drug. And that has a lot of relevance for the modern world, because we're now living in an unprecedented time of infinite access to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, including drugs that didn't exist before, like social media and video games, online pornography, as well as the intense drugification of previously adaptive behaviors like eating, right? So food has become a drug with the addition of salt, sugar, fat, and almost everything that we eat, turning what was once a normal, healthy behavior into a drug. Likewise, I'm hearing from a lot of readers who are addicted to things like chess, right? We think of chess as like a big brain activity that makes you smarter, but with the increased access to many online formats of games, people are increasingly struggling with addiction to games. And of course, in my book, I talk about my own addiction to romance novels, leading to an addiction to erotica, which is kind of a minor addiction for which there were not major consequences in my life, but nonetheless reflect that we're all on the spectrum of addiction. We all have the same ancient neurological wiring that makes us vulnerable to the problem of addiction. And we're living in a very addictogenic world. As I like to say, if you're not addicted yet, it's coming soon to a website near you. Importantly, also this idea of drug of choice, which you mentioned. So what makes one person, what one person might be vulnerable to, another person is not. And from an evolutionary perspective, it's probably true that nature made sure that we're different in this way so that we're not all going for the same reward, right? You want a tribe to be able to steward all of the resources it needs: water, food, clothing, shelter, mates. One way to do that is to turn up the volume on somebody's reinforcement for a given drug. So I might really be interested in finding a mate. You might be much more interested in finding something equivalent to a primitive cookie, right? But between the two of us, we will make sure that the tribe gets what it needs. However, in the modern world, we have so many more drugs and so much more access that even people who were previously immune to addiction or relatively immune, people who are not reinforced by traditional drugs like nicotine, alcohol, cannabis, These are people who might actually be very reinforced by things like social media. So therefore, again, we live in this addictogenic world.